Like horse
All right,
show.
my name is Sable Boroff, and I'm here at Triangle Square to do my history talk for today, and it's going to be on the San Francisco Gold Rush of 1849, which is what the football team is named after, is the 49ers. That's what they were called. So, to set a little background, in 1848 and prior to that, there were many Native Americans in California and about 200 non-Native people in San Francisco. 200. And there were about 170,000 Native Americans there at that time. And then in 1848, James Marshall discovered a bit of metal at Sutter's Mill, which was a mill for preparing grain. Sutter was a big landowner, and he was a farmer, and that was his mill for his grain. And James Marshall, who worked for him, discovered this little shiny thing in the stream there, because mills were always on streams. And he took it to Sutter, and they tested it, and they found out it was gold in 1848. And Sutter immediately wanted to conceal it because he didn't want people ruining his farmland. But the newspapers got hold of it almost that year. The New York Herald published a story about it. President Polk gave an address about it to Congress. And immediately Sutter had squatters that were ruining his land and stealing his crops and cattle. And the minute the gold rush started, thousands of people swarmed into the San Francisco area. It started out, as I said, with 200 non-native people. They came by land and sea. In order to come by sea, they had to go all the way through the bottom tip of South America, trek through the jungle and to the Isthmus of Panama, and then they had to take a steamship up to San Francisco. If they came by land, they had to go on the California Trail, which was very hazardous. You know, wagons, there were fighting, chlorea, shipwrecks, typhoid fever, starvation, terrible weather. I mean, it was very, very difficult to travel in those days. And right away, the people who were providing transportation and supplies for the miners made a lot of money. Some of the miners made a lot of money, and then they lost it. Some of them ended up broke. The supply ships would land in the harbor of San Francisco, and they would be abandoned. They'd unload their goods, and the crew would run off to mine gold, and they'd leave the ship there. And they turned these ships into housing, taverns, hotels. One was turned into a jail because they needed it. There was a lot of crime. And they used their lumber. And from the very beginning, there were a lot of U.S. people came, and also people from all over the world came to mine, from Latin America, from Chile. There were already mines in Chile and Latin America. They came from Mexico, they came from China, and from Australia. Australia was where England sent all her convicts instead of putting them in jail, so they came over. A lot of them were criminals. And the Irish had a potato famine in 1852. They came from there because they were all starving in Ireland. And from the very beginning, there was a tremendous lot of discrimination against non-white miners. And they had, especially terrible with the Chinese and the Latins. They were the two worst oppressed people. They had a Chinese Exclusion Act, a foreign miners tax. They really were and there was a lot of violence directed at the foreign miners. It was very vigilante. There was no police department, no government in the beginning. There were no laws, particularly no courts, no firemen either. They had multiple fires, which I'll talk about. No real way to put them out, particularly. I mean, except for buckets and people. But It was very much vigilante justice, and there were gangs that roamed the city that were violent gangs that took protection money from the businesses. So, and the natives were treated terribly, but I'll go into that in a little bit. So, yeah, there were 90,000 people arriving in 1849. That's non-white people, and again from China. There were very few women, and there were like thousands of men, like 40,000 men in the beginning, and 700 women. That's non-white people, and the women were very prized. A lot of them turned to prostitution, but whatever they did, it was very much freer society than the rest of the country. Women's roles and men's roles were very more free than they were in other areas of the country. Women who were working earned a lot more money in San Francisco than they did in other parts of the country for the same work. And many times women were widowed because the mining was very dangerous and disease. So they were very prized. And in the beginning, the gold was free for the taking. I mean, it was lying in the streams. It was very easy to get out. And again, there was claim jumping, or people stealing your gold. I mean, it was really a free-for-all of vigilantism. And at first they were just panning for gold, and then they started mining with hydraulic mining in 1853. And basically, they diverted streams and they poisoned the water with arsenic, mercury, and another toxic chemical, I can't remember. But the mining, like fracking today, uses very poisonous chemicals in the water to extract ore. And they ruined a lot of the Native Americans' land, and hunting and fishing and growing areas were ruined by the mining. And and the merchants got very rich. There was a merchant named Sam Brannan who was the richest man in San Francisco. He owned the town. I mean, every politician and every important person had to pay him tribute in order to get in office and stay there. I mean, he ran San Francisco. And one of the things that happened was in 1854 they built the San Francisco Mint because they had the equivalent, and I want to look up this number, in that few years that they were mining the gold, they extracted over $10 billion in today's money of gold. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. And so they opened the San Francisco Mint in 1854. They made gold the official standard for the currency in the country. The California banks, they sent the gold all over the world. It jump-started the U.S. economy. I mean, this is how powerful an effect it had. And also one thing that happened was they improved, the steamship was invented. They were using that. They did the railroad. They did the railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast, which basically super improved travel. It made it much safer and easier and faster to go from coast to coast. And there were so many people in the area that even when the gold ran out in the late 1850s, the easy gold was gone in the 1850s, So, but there were so many people there, and the land was so rich for agriculture that people stayed because of the agriculture, and the people grew wealthy farming now. And California still is one of the breadbaskets of the U.S. We do enormous amount of farming still here in California, and so we had all these people here, and then more came because of the railroad. And California became a state very quickly because of this gigantic population explosion. And one fun thing is one of the merchants was Levi Strauss, who was the inventor of blue jeans, and he was in 1853. He was selling clothes to the miners, and he developed a patent for denim pants, and that was blue jeans, which he developed in 1853. Still, we all wear them today. It's the same. That's why they call them Levi's. And he was Jewish, German Jew. And the Jews were mostly, they were there, and they were mostly merchants and bankers. They were not really so much miners. But they encouraged people to make schools and laws and civilization more there. And one of the things that happened, was that, no, wait, I'm getting a little lost here. Okay. One of the things was they had a lot of violent gangs in the vigilante period. There was a gang called the Sydney Ducks. Please turn that off. The Sydney Ducks, who were a very violent gang from Australia, of criminals from Australia. And they set fire to the city 6 times in about a 6-year period, burned down the whole city because it was all wood. There was no real fire brigade, no fire engines, and they destroyed the city 6 times because they were trying to divert activity from all their crime. And they finally drove them out, and then there were more gangs after that. So one thing that happened was they were all mining, and it was very hard work, and they wanted to let off steam. So what do the miners do in this wild and crazy town when they want to let off steam? Is they went to the Barbary Coast. And that area of San Francisco is a 9-block area between Pacific Street, Montgomery, and Stockton Streets, if you're familiar with the area. It's sort of the downtown area, and also near Chinatown in North Beach. And that was the red light district. And they had dance halls, saloons, jazz clubs, variety shows, and brothels in that area. And the miners would come in, with their gold, ready to spend money, and they'd do all the women there. And they had male dancing too. They had male dancing because there weren't enough women. And they would go to the dance halls and the whorehouses, and they'd spend money, and then they'd get drunk. And then they would be robbed by the owners of the places, or murdered too, and they would take their money. But they'd keep coming back because it was a lot of fun, and they had nowhere else to go. And so let's see. And also, so women in that time period were able to not only be prostitutes and madams. Boy, did these madams rake in the money. And that was a very complicated thing, being a madam. You had to run the whorehouse, but you also had to keep the police and the politicians from closing you down. So it was quite you had to be a good businessman to be a successful madam. Anyway, so and also women could be they could do laundry, they could have boarding houses, they could be cooks. One woman made $18,000 baking pies, which in 1850 was a lot of money, 18,000. I mean, women were in demand, and they they never lacked for a husband if they wanted one, because the minute their husband died, there were 10 men lined up ready to marry him. And there were jazz clubs on Terrific Street. Terrific Street, I don't know what street it is today up there, but there were jazz clubs there with Sophie Tucker, Jelly Roll Morton. They invented dances like the Turkey Trot, which were the very up and happening dances of the time. And there was a gay club called Dash in 1908 where they had female impersonators. And they would sell gay sex in the booths. Sounds like recent times more, but and there were also 2 lovely gay men. Now I tried to do research on gay life there because it must have been happening with so few women and so many men, but it was very hard to find on the internet. And I had to really dig to even get a little bit of information. But basically, I have a lovely story about two men, James Chamberlain and James Chaffee, and they lived together for 50 years. They met in their 20s. They were a mining town north of San Francisco. They fell in love right away. They got married. They lived for 50 years on the trail to Yosemite. And Bret Harte, who was a big writer at the time, wrote stories about them. And they were remembered for their kindness to strangers and their loyalty to each other. It's a lovely story. Chaffee died, Chamberlain 3 months later, and then he killed himself because he couldn't bear to be without his partner. But they were remembered everywhere for their kindness to everybody. So in the women in the gold rush, the Latin women, not Latin, but non-white women, did better than the non-white men because they could do a lot of jobs that they wouldn't let the men do. As far as the prostitutes go, the Chinese and Mexican prostitutes were on the very bottom of the barrel, and they were treated very badly. The French and Caucasian prostitutes were the top of the ladder, just what you'd expect, and they made quite a lot of money. But many women could earn way more doing all these things, baking pies or running a boarding house, than they could anywhere else in the country because there was a big shortage. Now, one thing that happened with the Native Americans was that they started out, and I want to get these figures because they started out with a very large Native American population, and they ended up with very few because the U.S. government, with all this money involved, declared genocide on the Native Americans. They said it's God's will that we either kill them or drive them away. I mean, that was God's will to these people. And they did that, and they just wholesale, they killed them, they raped their women, they stole their children and made them work in the mines. I mean, they were horrible. And they also ruined all their farming lands. They broke every treaty that they'd made, every single one, because they wanted to steal the land. And they also died in large numbers from disease from all the Europeans because they had no resistance to the European diseases. And basically, they ended up with, I think, 30,000 Native Americans by the end of the gold rush. They had 170,000 prior to that. It was one of the very largest Native populations in the country. And it was all gone in a few years, almost all gone. It was terrible. And so now one last thing, and there were also, there were some interesting people here. So there was Julia Shannon, who was a female studio photographer, which was very unusual in that time, but because, again, the roles were looser out west, she was able to do that. There was a female card shark, Madame Mustache, who I mentioned in one of my other talks. There was a woman, Mary Pleasant, who used her vast wealth to free slaves through the Underground Railroad in the Civil War. There were barbers, nurses, and school teachers, circus performers. Women managed theaters, which they never did anywhere else. Another owned a bowling alley. One was a bullfighter. And mixed marriages were more common in California and less looked down on than other parts of the country, and divorce was easier than other parts of the country. So there was also a black slave, and I don't have her name. She was very beautiful and very smart, and her southern slave owner sent her to Boston to be educated because he wanted her to, she was so intelligent, but she just never went back to the South, so she was free. And she married a rich black man, and when he died, she took $50,000 and set up a boarding house in San Francisco, where she heard all the stock talk. She had the elite of the city in her boarding house. The politicians, all the bankers, the stockbrokers, they all boarded there. And she heard all the stock tips, and she made a fortune investing her money. So she was a real smart cookie. And there was another woman named Donalda Cameron, and she rescued young Chinese sex slaves. And she was called a she-devil by the slavers, and they had her marked for death. But she got the last laugh because she lived to be 98 and died in 1968. They never killed her, although they tried. And the girls called her Good Mother, and they said she rescued thousands of young girls and got them better lives. So, the last thing I want to talk about is, here's another, not quite the last thing. So the prostitutes were called painted ladies, and they wore makeup. Now, they wore short skirts, which in those days were knee-length. Today, we would not call it short, but that was very scandalous to have a knee-length skirt. They wore petticoats. They had very low, cut dresses, garters. Many had pistols or jeweled daggers in their bosoms to protect themselves. And the dance hall girls were not whores. They just danced, but they made a lot of money. And they even had same-sex dancing on the boats from Panama to San Francisco, because, again, it was mostly men. And they said the more feminine men would dress up in dresses, and they'd turkey trot and dance with the other men.
Cute.
And there was one man. She was born a woman, Alberta, and she changed her name to Alan Hart, and she became a doctor. This is the first transsexual ever. She got a hysterectomy in 1900 something or other, early, to change her sex. So that's all they could do in those days, give her a hysterectomy. But she became a doctor. She worked in the hospital. She wrote 4 novels and had 2 marriages, living as a man. So that was one of the very early pioneers of that. And I want to end on this. The Native Americans, and you may not know this or you may know it, a lot of them had gay men in the Native American tribes. Multiple tribes had very honorable roles for gay men. And they wore women's clothing, they did female duties, they were like wives of the important Native American leaders. Even Crazy Horse himself had a man in his harem as one of his wives. And they were very well respected as healers, medicine men, seers, and they definitely had an honored role in multiple tribes of Native Americans. And the whites were extremely bad to these men, even worse than they were to the other Native Americans. They were awful to them. But anyway, so that's the story of the gold rush, and the San Francisco 49ers are named after. They were called the 49ers. So I'm hoping it was entertaining, and thank you.
Thank you.